It started with a laugh. A soft, unguarded burst of laughter that should have sounded harmless, but instead cracked open a chasm in my chest. I was in our driveway, wrench in hand, leaning over the rusted-out corpse of our second car, which had taken to dying at inopportune moments. Rachel had promised me she'd get it checked out months ago, but here I was, elbows deep in grease, trying to coax life out of a battery that had all the enthusiasm of a hungover cat. And then I heard it, that laugh. I glanced over my shoulder toward the garage, its door yawning open, and saw Rachel. She was on the phone, standing in the dim light, her shoulders relaxed, eyes sparkling. I couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like that, like something genuinely delighted her, no strings attached. Her laughter was rich, layered, and full of warmth. The kind of laugh she used to reserve for stupid inside jokes we'd make up on long car rides, back when we still found joy in getting lost together. I straightened up, wincing as my back protested. The moment stretched out, my ears straining for whatever she'd say next. She cupped her hand around her mouth as if to trap the secret, then spoke softly, almost conspiratorially. "You're such an idiot," she said, but there was affection dripping off every syllable. Not the playful scolding she used with me, the one that masked irritation. This was different. Intimate. I felt a ripple of something unnameable pass through me, something that tightened in my gut. But it wasn't until I saw her expression, eyes glinting like she'd just won a private, delightful game, that I felt the first real pang of unease. A deep, bone-set unease. She was laughing again, biting her lip to stifle the sound, and I stood there, forgotten, a voyeur in my own life. "Who's that?" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. It sliced through her laughter, and she startled, eyes snapping toward me. She fumbled with the phone, the laughter evaporating from her face like steam off a hot sidewalk. "No one," she said, a bit too quickly, flashing me a brittle smile. Her fingers moved to end the call, and she slipped the phone into her blazer pocket like she was hiding a weapon. I wanted to let it go. I really did. But something about that laugh, so foreign, so unlike the Rachel I'd come to know over years of dinners eaten in silence and affectionate shoulder squeezes in lieu of proper hugs, stuck with me. It felt like hearing a ghost, the ghost of someone Rachel used to be, and I had no idea what it meant or how to exorcise it. I should have let it drop. We all want to think we're better than our insecurities, that we're solid, well-adjusted adults who trust the people we love. But the truth is simpler: when something feels wrong, it festers. It claws at you, even if it makes you look like a jealous fool. Rachel drove off shortly after our awkward exchange, leaving me with a dying car and a head full of suspicions. Fixing the car could wait. I went inside, my mind turning over every moment from that morning. She'd been extra careful, hadn't she? Careful in the way she moved, the way she smiled, the way she ended that call without so much as an extra breath. I sat at the kitchen table, running my fingers over the dented edges of our old cutting board, trying to think straight. What did I actually know? A phone call, a laugh. Was that enough to get worked up over? I knew I needed something concrete, something real to explain why my heart wouldn't settle down. The answer came 2 days later, when I found the first clue, a receipt. I was digging through the glove compartment of Rachel's car, hoping to find the insurance paperwork. Instead, I pulled out a crumpled receipt from a restaurant called Il Papavero, a place we'd never been. It wasn't one of those generic chain restaurants, it was an upscale Italian bistro downtown that Rachel had always described as too pricey for a casual night out. The receipt was dated from a week ago, for 2 people, with a handwritten note scribbled on the back: "Can't wait to do this again. Loved every second." There was no name, just that short message scrawled in blue ink. I remember feeling the blood drain from my face, my body suddenly cold, my hands trembling. The details unraveled from there, one thread at a time. I learned to listen, really listen. When she came home late from work 2 days later, her excuse sounded rehearsed. I knew Rachel. She could ad-lib with the best of them, but this was different. Stiff. Staged. Her answers were peppered with pauses, and she was too eager to wrap up the conversation, like she was closing a curtain on a bad play. I stopped sleeping properly. Every night, I stared at the dark ceiling, wondering who the hell she was when I wasn't around. Each day I became a detective in my own house, watching Rachel the way a stranger might. I noticed small things, the way she picked up her phone, shielding the screen from me, or how she dressed a bit nicer on the days she said she had meetings. The worst discovery, though, came on a Wednesday afternoon. I'd taken a rare day off, claiming a stomach bug, but I stayed home for one reason: to see if Rachel's lies held up. Her schedule hadn't changed. She was supposed to be in back-to-back meetings. I expected nothing. Just another quiet day in the empty house. But at 1:30 p.m., I spotted her out the front window. She wasn't at work, she was right here, in our driveway. She wasn't alone. A man I'd never seen before stood beside her, tall, dark-haired, wearing a tailored coat that fit him too perfectly. Rachel had that look again, that softness around her eyes and lips. She was laughing, her body turned towards him, open, relaxed, like she'd just let him into her own private world. They didn't touch. But it was the way she looked at him, the way she seemed so alive and happy, that left no doubt. It felt worse than if I'd caught them in bed. Because this wasn't just physical, it was something deeper. Something I hadn't seen in her eyes when she looked at me in a long time. I didn't confront them right then. I stayed behind the curtains, jaw clenched, fists trembling at my sides. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't feel it anymore. I was just numb. I waited until she got home that evening, feeling like I was standing on the edge of something violent and irreversible. Rachel came in through the front door at her usual time, set her keys on the counter, and slipped off her shoes. Everything about her seemed perfectly ordinary, and it made my anger sharper, cleaner. I was done playing it cool. "We need to talk," I said, barely recognizing the edge in my voice. She paused, halfway out of her second shoe, looking up at me. There was a flicker of surprise, maybe even worry, but she kept her face neutral. "Okay," she said carefully. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, every word ready to shatter whatever thin illusion of normalcy we had left. "Where were you this afternoon?" I asked, eyes locked onto hers. She blinked, the question catching her off guard. "What do you mean?" Her voice was too casual, the way someone talks when they're pretending not to know where a conversation is headed. "I mean, I was here," I said, "and you were supposed to be at work." "But you were with someone. In our driveway. Laughing like he was the funniest person you'd ever met." My hands were clenched so tight I could feel my nails pressing into my palms, but I didn't care. "Who is he, Rachel?" Her expression flickered, just a second, but it was enough. Fear, then something else. Guilt? Panic? I couldn't tell. She crossed her arms over her chest, defensive. "You were spying on me," she shot back, her tone shifting to outrage, like the best defense she had was an offense. "That's not the point," I said. "I saw you. I'm asking you, right now, to tell me the truth. Who is he?" She was silent for a moment, lips pressed into a thin line. "It's complicated," she finally said, her voice cracking just a little. The same voice she used when she tried to be diplomatic during our fights. Like she could smooth over this mess if she just chose the right words. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." I felt something in me snap. All those nights of doubt, the days of pretending not to notice the distance between us, had hardened into something brittle and dangerous. Rachel exhaled, a shaky breath that made my blood boil. "His name is Eric," she admitted, her voice dropping. "We work together." She wouldn't look me in the eyes. "It's not what you think." "Oh, it's not?" I said, each word dripping with disbelief. "Then what is it, exactly? You lying to me about where you are, laughing with him like he's the one making you happy these days? What is that if it's not an affair?" Her jaw tightened, and she looked up, eyes flashing with a mix of anger and desperation. It's just emotional," she said, her voice rising defensively. "We've been talking, yes. About things. Work, life, us. But I haven't." She cut herself off, like she realized how stupid she sounded. "Save it," I interrupted, taking a step back, disgusted. "You think that makes it better? That you're just sharing everything with him that you can't bother to share with me?" "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, and now her voice was small, almost pathetic. "I didn't plan this, okay? It just happened. I was lonely, you were distant." Her eyes shone with angry tears. "We've both been unhappy. You're going to blame this on me?" I said, my voice rising. "You think that gives you a free pass to sneak around, to hide some whole other side of yourself from me?" "I'm not perfect," she snapped back. "And neither are you. I tried, but everything felt dead between us, and I needed someone who saw me." Her tears were falling now, but I felt no sympathy. Just a cold, raw sense of betrayal. The confrontation wasn't elegant or satisfying. It was ugly, loud, full of words we couldn't take back. By the time we'd exhausted our accusations and excuses, the house felt like a place neither of us belonged in anymore. And I was only just getting started. The anger didn't fade after our shouting match. If anything, it crystallized into something harsher, a need to do more than just sit around feeling like the wronged party. I wanted Rachel to feel the cracks in our marriage the way I was feeling them, to understand that trust isn't something you break and hope to tape back together with apologies. So I got deliberate. Methodical. You spend 15 years with someone, you learn exactly where their vulnerabilities lie. Rachel wasn't just my wife, she was also someone who prided herself on having it all together. She loved control over her work, her image, our social circle. She couldn't stand looking messy or unreliable. That's what I went after first. I decided to target her reputation. Rachel had an important presentation coming up at work, the kind where she'd be in front of all the higher-ups, the one she'd been nervously perfecting for weeks. I knew the date, the time, the stakes. She'd mentioned it at least a dozen times, probably hoping I'd express interest. Instead, I started thinking about how to make that day a disaster for her. The plan unfolded in small steps. I made a few anonymous phone calls to her company's HR department, hinting at her inappropriate relationship with Eric. I knew HR would have to investigate, even if I couldn't give them my real name. Rachel had always been careful to avoid office gossip, so the idea that she might be the center of it? That was a grenade I was happy to roll into her perfect little world. But I didn't stop there. The morning of her big presentation, I sabotaged her carefully curated image. I knew exactly where she kept her wardrobe essentials, that favorite power suit, her immaculate white blouse, all pressed and lined up in our closet. I made a small, almost invisible cut along the seams of the blouse and left her iron on just long enough to scorch the fabric. Harmless in the grand scheme, but enough to shake her sense of control. When she came downstairs that morning, she was frantic. "What happened to my blouse?" she demanded, holding up the shirt with a growing stain where it had burned. Her voice cracked with anxiety, and I stood there with my coffee, barely suppressing a smile. "No idea," I replied, feigning innocence. "Maybe you were distracted. Funny how that happens, isn't it?" Rachel didn't have time to engage. She left in a rush, and I imagined her fumbling through that presentation, off her game, trying to hold it all together while whispers about her and Eric spread through the office halls. For a moment, the revenge felt good. Just a small taste of what I wanted her to feel: embarrassment, insecurity, that gnawing sense that everything was unraveling. But satisfaction, I quickly learned, is as fleeting as it is empty. The rush didn't last. It was replaced by something much darker, a hollowness that crept in when I wasn't expecting it. That evening, when she came home, Rachel looked drained, eyes rimmed red from what I assumed were tears or stress. She barely said a word, just dropped her bag by the door and sank into the nearest chair. I should have felt victorious. But instead, seeing her like that stirred up something more complicated than triumph. Something I wasn't ready to look at too closely yet. The day after my petty acts of sabotage, the silence between us was suffocating. Rachel didn't mention the burned blouse, the HR rumors, or the disaster of her presentation. We existed in the same space but not really together, moving through our routines like two strangers sharing a waiting room. I spent the day waiting for the next fight, some kind of explosion to release all the pressure building up. But she just avoided me, which somehow hurt more. By late evening, I couldn't stand it anymore. I found her in our bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone but not really seeing the screen. Her hair was a mess, her face pale and worn. For the first time, I saw someone who looked genuinely broken. It didn't make me feel triumphant or satisfied. It made me feel tired. So damn tired. "We need to talk," I said, standing in the doorway. My voice was lower, less angry than it had been during our previous confrontation. Maybe it was the fatigue, or maybe I'd finally run out of rage. Rachel looked up at me, her eyes wary but too exhausted to put up much of a fight. "What's left to say?" she whispered. I stepped into the room and sat down in the chair by the window, facing her. "Everything," I replied. "None of this makes sense to me. We're sitting here, pretending we can just keep doing this, but we can't." She didn't argue, didn't try to push back. Instead, she stared at her hands, her fingers interlocked and trembling. "I know," she said quietly. Her voice had lost its defensive edge, replaced with something that almost sounded like regret. We sat there for a moment, the room heavy with unspoken words. I didn't know where to start, so I just spoke what was on my mind. "Why him?" I asked. "Out of everyone, why Eric? What did he give you that I didn't?" Rachel rubbed her eyes, clearly battling some emotion she didn't want to show. "It wasn't about him," she said finally. "It was about me. About feeling seen, heard, alive." She let out a bitter laugh. "We've both been miserable for so long, haven't we? You stopped looking at me like I mattered. And I guess I stopped trying to make you look." I sat back, the weight of her words pressing into me. She was right. I didn't want to admit it, but she was. Somewhere along the line, we'd both stopped trying. We'd let the comfort of routine replace the effort we used to put into loving each other. But admitting that didn't make her betrayal any easier to swallow. "So you found someone else to make you feel good," I said. My voice wasn't angry, just hollow. "And I'm supposed to just understand that?" "No," she said. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even forgive myself. But I was desperate, and I made the worst decisions I could have made. I hurt you. I know that. And if I could take it back." "Yeah, well," I interrupted, running a hand over my face, "we both know you can't." A long silence followed. The kind of silence that feels like a heavy weight pressing down, forcing you to face things you'd rather ignore. Finally, she spoke, her voice so soft I almost missed it. "What do we do now?" That question sat between us, loaded and final. I thought about everything I'd done to hurt her back, how none of it had made me feel any better. How even the idea of forgiveness felt absurd, but the idea of continuing this war felt even worse. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know I can't live like this. Maybe we need time apart. Maybe we need to think about what we really want, whether there's anything left here worth fighting for." Rachel looked up, her eyes wide and wet. "Do you think there is?" I didn't have an answer. "Not yet. I think we both need to figure that out for ourselves," I said. My voice cracked, and for a second, I felt the sadness rush in, stronger than any anger I'd ever felt. "We owe each other at least that." She nodded slowly, tears rolling down her face, and for the first time in weeks, there was a fragile honesty between us. The kind that comes when you've destroyed each other so thoroughly that there's nothing left to hide. I slept on the couch that night, though calling it sleep was generous. My mind wouldn't shut off, replaying everything that had led us here. The fight, the betrayal, my childish need for revenge, all of it was a tangled mess that left me feeling more lost than anything else. As dawn broke, I knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, it wouldn't be about winning. It had to be about finding some kind of peace. Rachel woke up before me, or maybe she hadn't slept at all either. She came downstairs, moving quietly, like she was afraid any sound might shatter the uneasy calm between us. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, my body stiff and sore from the couch. We didn't say anything at first. She made coffee, 2 mugs, just like she had every morning for years. It felt like a strange attempt at normalcy, but we both knew nothing about this was normal. She handed me a mug, and for a second, our hands brushed. We both flinched, pulling away too quickly. The awkwardness was thick, but we forced ourselves to sit down together at that kitchen table. I don't think I'd ever felt so disconnected from someone sitting 3 feet away from me. We need to figure out how to move forward, I finally said, my voice breaking the silence. Together or apart, I don't know. But we can't keep pretending. Rachel nodded, her eyes focused on her hands wrapped around her mug. I know, she whispered. Her voice was raw, like she'd run out of defenses. I never wanted this to turn into, whatever this is. I wanted to fix things, not destroy them. But I did. I destroyed us. Hearing her admit that should have brought some satisfaction, but instead, it made the sadness sharper. We both did, I said. The words tasted bitter, but I knew they were true. It wasn't just her affair or my revenge. It was the years of neglect, the quiet resignation that had built walls between us long before Eric showed up. We talked, not like a couple trying to save their marriage, but like two people who needed to understand why everything had fallen apart. The conversation was painful and ugly. We laid out all the things we'd buried, the resentment, the disappointments, the way we'd let life turn into a series of routines instead of something meaningful. By the end of it, we were both exhausted, but it felt like the first honest conversation we'd had in years. We agreed that we couldn't just sweep this under the rug. We needed space. Time apart to figure out who we were without each other, to understand if there was any love left that hadn't been tainted by all the damage. Rachel decided to stay with her sister for a while. She packed a small bag, and I watched as she stood at the front door, looking back at me one last time. I'm sorry, she said, her voice thick with tears. I wanted to say something meaningful, but nothing felt right. So I just nodded, and she walked out. The door clicked shut, and the silence left behind felt enormous. I sat there for a long time, feeling the emptiness settle around me. In the days that followed, I learned that healing doesn't come in dramatic waves. It's slow, uneven, and confusing. Some days, I felt like I could breathe again, like I was beginning to see a life beyond the mess we'd made. Other days, the weight of everything came crashing back, and I questioned whether anything would ever feel normal. What did I learn from all of this? That people are more fragile than we like to admit, that love isn't indestructible, and that sometimes holding on to anger only deepens the wounds. I didn't know if Rachel and I would ever find our way back to each other. But I knew I had to find myself again first, to rebuild who I was without being consumed by what had happened. As for what's next? It's not a neatly wrapped ending. There's no clear path forward, no sudden revelation. Just the hope that, someday, things might make sense again. And for now, that's enough.